Chapter 1. The Island of Shadows. The causeway stretched before us like a grey ribbon across the restless waters, leading to that extraordinary silhouette which has haunted the imagination of men for 1,000 years. Mont Saint-Michel rose from the Norman sands with all the medieval grandeur of a fairy tale, its Gothic spires reaching toward the October sky as if to pierce the very heavens themselves. "Magnifique, is it not, Hastings?" remarked my friend Hercule Poirot, adjusting his overcoat against the salt-tinged breeze. "The Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel, she has witnessed much history, that one. Much beauty, much devotion. And I suspect, much darkness also." I shifted uncomfortably in my motor-car seat, watching the ancient fortress grow larger as our driver navigated the narrow causeway. The tide was retreating, leaving dark pools of sea-water scattered across the sand like mirrors reflecting the grey afternoon sky. Flocks of ravens wheeled about the abbey's towers, their harsh cries carried on the wind. "I must say, Poirot," I ventured, "this doesn't strike me as the sort of place one chooses for a restful holiday. Rather gloomy, what?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Mais non, mon ami. Sometimes the spirit requires not the sunshine of the Riviera, but the contemplation that comes with ancient stones and the rhythm of the tides. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I have been invited to observe something most interesting, the decoding of a medieval manuscript of considerable importance. Our driver, a weathered Breton with hands gnarled from years of fishing, glanced at us in his mirror. 'You gentlemen are here for Professor Blackwood's gathering, then?' he asked, in accented English. 'Strange business, if you ask me, all these learned folk, poking about in old books and muttering about curses. The island doesn't like to have her secrets disturbed.' 'Curses?' I inquired, raising an eyebrow. The driver shrugged. 'The old stories, monsieur. They say the abbey guards its mysteries jealously. The crows, they are the island's watchers. When too many strangers come seeking what should remain hidden—' He left the sentence, hanging ominously. Poirot made a small sound of interest. 'And what, precisely, should remain hidden?' 'The Codex Corvus,' the driver replied, lowering his voice. 'The Book of Ravens, they call it. Medieval manuscript, full of dark tales. Some say it tells of a great betrayal, a scholar's death, and a curse upon those who would steal the work of others. Professor Blackwood and his group, they think they can unlock its secrets. Perhaps they should leave sleeping dogs to lie, eh?' We had reached the Abbey's outer walls, and our conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a tall, distinguished gentleman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He approached our vehicle with the confident stride of one accustomed to commanding attention. 'Professor Blackwood, I presume?' Poirot inquired, as we alighted from the motor car. 'Indeed, Monsieur Poirot. Edmund Blackwood, at your service.' The professor's handshake was firm, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Cambridge. 'I cannot tell you how honoured we are to have you join our little scholarly gathering. Your reputation precedes you, of course.' 'You are most kind, Professor,' Poirot replied with a small bow. 'I confess myself most curious about this Codex Corvus, a manuscript of the medieval period, n'est-ce pas?' Professor Blackwood's eyes lit with enthusiasm. 13th century, we believe. A remarkable document that may revolutionize our understanding of medieval scholarship and other matters. But come, let me introduce you to our little group.' He led us through the abbey's ancient gateway, our footsteps echoing on worn stone. The interior courtyard was shadowed by towering walls, and I felt an involuntary shiver at the Gothic atmosphere. Several figures moved about the cloisters, their voices hushed, in the manner of those engaged in scholarly discourse. 'Dr. Margaret Wynne,' Professor Blackwood announced, indicating a woman of perhaps 40 years, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes. There was something in her expression, a watchfulness, a barely concealed intensity, that immediately caught my attention. Dr. Wynne is our expert in medieval paleography. Her knowledge of manuscript analysis is quite exceptional. Dr. Wynne inclined her head politely. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, I've heard much about your methods of investigation. I confess I find them fascinating. The application of logical analysis to human behavior bears similarities to the decoding of ancient texts. Vraiment? Poirot seemed genuinely intrigued. And what, may I ask, drew you to this particular manuscript? Something flickered across Dr. Wynne's features. Pain, perhaps, or old anger. Academic interest, Monsieur Poirot. The Codex Corvus may contain references to scholars of my father's generation. I hope to learn more about certain historical events. Before Poirot could pursue this intriguing response, we were interrupted by the approach of a younger man with dark hair and a bitter expression. His clothes, while well made, showed signs of wear, and there was something in his manner that suggested barely controlled resentment. Henri Dubois, Professor Blackwood said, though with noticeably less warmth than he had shown Dr. Wynne. Henri was once my most promising student. He has particular expertise in the architectural history of medieval abbeys. Dubois' jaw tightened. Professor, he acknowledged curtly, then turned to us. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, I trust you will find our work here illuminating. The word seemed weighted with meaning, and I noticed Dr. Wynne's sharp glance at the young Frenchman. Professor Blackwood cleared his throat uncomfortably. And here we have Mr. James Crawford visiting us from America, he continued, indicating a man of middle years with sandy hair and intelligent grey eyes. Crawford had the look of someone accustomed to observing rather than being observed. Pleased to meet you, gentlemen, Crawford said in a distinctly American accent. I'm something of an amateur historian myself. The opportunity to witness the decoding of such a significant manuscript was too good to pass up. Poirot studied the American with interest. And your particular field of study, Monsieur Crawford? Oh, this and that, Crawford replied vaguely. I have a general interest in historical mysteries, unsolved academic questions. Sometimes the past has ways of reaching into the present, don't you think? Finally, we were introduced to Brother Augustine, the abbey's keeper of manuscripts, an elderly monk whose pale eyes seemed to hold secrets accumulated over decades of tending ancient books. His greeting was courteous but reserved, and I sensed he viewed our scholarly gathering with some unease. The brothers have graciously allowed us to work in the scriptorium, Professor Blackwood explained, as he led us deeper into the abbey. The Codex Corvus requires careful handling, and the scriptorium provides ideal conditions for our research. As we entered the ancient chamber, where generations of monks had copied and illuminated manuscripts, I was struck by the weight of history pressing down upon us. Tall windows filtered the afternoon light, casting long shadows across the stone floor. At the center of the room, upon a lectern of dark wood, lay an open manuscript, its pages yellowed with age, its illuminated borders glowing with faded gold and crimson. Voila, Professor Blackwood said reverently, the Codex Corvus. Even from a distance, I could see the intricate illustrations that decorated the margins, ravens with spread wings, scholars bent over books, and darker images that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. There was something unsettling about the manuscript, something that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. Poirot approached the lectern with his characteristic deliberate movements, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Most remarkable, he murmured. The illuminations, they tell a story, n'est-ce pas? Indeed they do, Dr. Wynne replied, moving to stand beside him. A story of betrayal, theft, and Justice. Long delayed. The shadows seemed to deepen as she spoke, and outside the scriptorium windows I could hear the harsh cries of ravens echoing through the twilight. Chapter 2. Dawn Brings Death. I awoke to a sound that chilled my very soul. Not the gentle chiming of the abbey bells that had lulled me to sleep, but the frenzied cawing of what seemed like 1,000 ravens. The cacophony was deafening, rising and falling in waves of harsh discord that penetrated even the thick stone walls of our guest quarters. Glancing at my pocket watch, I saw that it was barely past dawn, 5:30 in the morning. The grey October light filtering through the narrow window held that peculiar quality of early morning at the seaside, neither fully dark nor properly bright. I dressed hastily and made my way to Poirot's chamber, finding my friend already fully clothed and standing at his window, his face grave with concentration. "Mon Dieu, Hastings," he murmured without turning around. "Listen to those birds. It is most extraordinary, n'est-ce pas? In all my years I have never heard such a disturbance from the creatures of the air." "Perhaps it's the weather," I suggested, joining him at the window. "The wind has picked up considerably since last evening." But even as I spoke, I knew my explanation was inadequate. The ravens were not simply agitated by wind or weather. Their cries held something approaching hysteria, as if they had witnessed something that violated the natural order of their ancient domain. "We must investigate," Poirot declared, reaching for his overcoat. "When nature herself protests so vehemently, Poirot, he pays attention." We made our way through the Abbey's corridors, our footsteps echoing hollowly in the pre-dawn stillness. The sound of the ravens grew ever louder as we approached the main courtyard, and when we finally emerged into the open air, the sight that greeted us was both magnificent and terrible. The sky above Mont Saint-Michel was black with birds, hundreds upon hundreds of ravens wheeling and diving around the Abbey's highest spire. They formed a dark, living cloud against the pale morning sky, their cries rising to an almost deafening crescendo. And there, silhouetted against this avian maelstrom, was a sight that made my blood run cold. A human figure was impaled upon the iron cross that crowned the Abbey's tallest tower, spread-eagled against the morning sky like some grotesque scarecrow. Even from the courtyard below, there could be no doubt that the person was dead. The unnatural positioning of the limbs, the absolute stillness amidst the chaos of the circling ravens, spoke eloquently of mortality's final victory. "Sacré bleu," Poirot breathed, his sharp eyes fixed upon the horrible spectacle above. "But this, it is impossible. How could anyone have reached such a height? And why? Why do they arrange the body in such a manner?" Other members of our scholarly party had begun to emerge from their quarters, drawn by the unearthly clamour of the ravens. Dr. Wynne appeared first, her dark hair hastily pinned, and her face pale with shock as she followed our gaze upward. "Dear God," she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. Is that Professor Blackwood?" Henri Dubois materialized at her side, his bitter expression replaced by one of genuine horror. "It cannot be," he said hoarsely. "How could anyone have climbed to such a place? The spire, it is accessible only to the birds themselves." James Crawford joined our grim assembly, his American practicality asserting itself even in the face of such an appalling sight. "We need to get the authorities," he said firmly. "And a doctor, though I fear there's nothing to be done for the poor fellow." Brother Augustine approached from the direction of the chapel, his aged face creased with distress. "The ravens," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. They always know when death comes to the island. The old stories speak of such things. The murder of crows that serves as the Abbey's witness and judge. Murder of crows? I repeated, though I suspected I knew the answer. The collective noun for ravens, monsieur, the monk explained, his pale eyes never leaving the figure on the spire. But in the ancient tales of this place it means something more. The ravens of Mont Saint-Michel are said to gather when justice must be served, when old sins come home to roost. Superstition, Crawford said dismissively, though his voice lacked conviction. Brother Augustine's gaze was steady. Perhaps, Monsieur Crawford, but the Codex Corvus itself speaks of such things, and now— He gestured toward the spire where the dark birds continued their frenzied dance around the impaled figure. The Codex Corvus, Dr. Wynne repeated slowly, her voice strange. Of course, the positioning of the body, it's exactly like the illumination on page 47. The scholar pierced like the illumination on page 47. The scholar pierced by the spear of justice, surrounded by the ravens of retribution. Poirot's head snapped toward her with interest. You remember this illumination precisely, madame? Yes, she replied, her colour heightening. I made particular study of that page yesterday evening. The imagery was quite striking. Henri Dubois was nodding slowly, a look of fascination replacing his initial horror. She's correct, Monsieur Poirot. The manuscript depicts just such a scene, a scholar punished for his theft of another's work, elevated high for all to see his shame. Most interesting, Poirot murmured, his little grey cells clearly beginning their work. And tell me, was Professor Blackwood aware of this particular illustration? Certainly, Crawford answered. We all examined it together yesterday. Blackwood was particularly interested in that section of the manuscript. He said it might hold the key to understanding the entire text. The arrival of the local police interrupted our discussion. Inspector Beaumont of the Norman Constabulary was a sturdy man with greying whiskers and the harried look of one unaccustomed to crimes more complex than smuggling or poaching. He listened to our account with growing bewilderment, frequently glancing upward at the impossible sight of the body on the spire. But how is such a thing accomplished? He demanded, his English heavily accented. The tower, she is more than 50 meters high. There are no ladders, no ropes, no means of ascent. It is as if the man has flown there like a bird himself. Or been placed there by supernatural means, Brother Augustine added quietly, earning a sharp look from the inspector. There will be no talk of supernatural intervention, Inspector Beaumont declared firmly. This is a matter for the police, not for superstition. We must find a rational explanation. Poirot stepped forward, with his characteristic small bow. Inspector, permit me to introduce myself. I am Hercule Poirot, and I should be honoured to assist in your investigation if you would welcome such aid. The inspector's eyes widened with recognition. Monsieur Poirot, but of course your reputation is known even here in Normandy. Indeed, I should be most grateful for your assistance. This case, it presents difficulties of the most unusual nature. Précisément, Poirot agreed. And the first question we must answer is not how the crime was committed, but why it was staged in such a theatrical manner. The positioning of the body, the time of the discovery, the very presence of the ravens, all of this speaks to a mind that wishes to create a specific impression. Dr. Wynne shivered visibly. You think this was planned? That someone deliberately arranged for Professor Blackwood to be found in this way? I think, madame, that nothing about this crime is as it appears, Poirot replied gravely. The killer, he has gone to considerable trouble to create a puzzle, not merely to commit murder, but to transform it into a statement. And statements, they are made for audiences. Inspector Beaumont was taking notes furiously. But the physical impossibility remains, Monsieur Poirot. Even with planning, How does one transport a body to such a height? Ah, Poirot said, his eyes twinkling despite the grim circumstances. That, mon brave inspector, is what we must discover. But first, I suggest we examine the scriptorium and the manuscript itself. I have a feeling that the Codex Corvus would prove most illuminating indeed. As we prepared to return to the Abbey proper, I caught sight of something that made me pause. There, barely visible, in the shadow of the great tower's base, were several black feathers scattered on the stone, not the natural moult of the circling ravens, but feathers that seemed deliberately placed, as if someone had left them as a calling card or perhaps a warning. The murder of crows continued their aerial dance above us, their harsh cries echoing off the ancient stones like a requiem for the dead scholar who hung silhouetted against the grey Norman sky. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Scriptorium. The Scriptorium, which had seemed so peacefully scholarly the evening before, now held an atmosphere of barely suppressed tension. The morning light streaming through the tall Gothic windows cast long shadows across the stone floor, and the Codex Corvus lay open upon its lectern like an accusatory finger pointing towards secrets yet to be revealed. Poirot moved with his characteristic deliberate precision around the ancient chamber, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Inspector Beaumont followed somewhat less gracefully, his heavy boots echoing on the flagstones as he attempted to match my friend's methodical approach to investigation. "Now then," Poirot announced, positioning himself before the assembled group, "we must proceed with order and method. Each of you will please to tell Poirot exactly what you observed yesterday evening, and more importantly, what you may have noticed about the good Professor Blackwood's state of mind." Dr. Margaret Wynne was the first to step forward, her composed demeanour from the previous evening now showing cracks of strain. She clasped her hands tightly before her, and I noticed a slight tremor in her fingers. Professor Blackwood seemed particularly excited about a passage he'd been studying, she began, her voice carefully controlled. He claimed it might revolutionize our understanding of medieval academic practices. He was quite animated about it. "And this passage, it concerned what precisely?" Poirot inquired, his head tilted slightly to one side, in that bird-like manner that indicated his fullest attention. Dr. Wynne's composure faltered for just a moment. "It detailed an incident from the 13th century, a scholar accused of stealing another's work. The manuscript describes his punishment in graphic detail." "Ah, the very illumination that so closely resembles our poor professor's final situation," Poirot observed. "Most curious. And did Professor Blackwood express any particular theories about this medieval incident?" "He believed it might not be merely historical record," she replied slowly. "He thought it could be connected to more recent academic disputes. He mentioned something about patterns repeating themselves across the centuries." Henri Dubois shifted uncomfortably in the shadows near the tall windows. "Professor Blackwood had many theories," he said, with barely concealed bitterness. "Not all of them were sound." Poirot turned his penetrating gaze upon the young Frenchman. "You disagreed with his scholarship, Monsieur Dubois?" "I disagreed with his methods," Henri replied sharply. "Professor Blackwood had a tendency to appropriate the insights of others. He was not always scrupulous about attribution." Inspector Beaumont's eyebrows rose. "You're suggesting Professor Blackwood was guilty of plagiarism?" "I am stating it as fact," Henri declared, his restraint finally breaking. "My doctoral thesis, my years of research into the architectural symbolism of medieval abbeys." He claimed it as his own work when he published his book on medieval abbeys. He claimed it as his own work when he published his book on monastic construction. My career was destroyed, my reputation ruined, all so that Edmund Blackwood could add another laurel to his academic crown. The silence that followed this outburst was profound. Dr. Wynne studied Henri with new interest, while James Crawford maintained his position near the manuscript, his grey eyes watchful and calculating. "A serious accusation," Poirot observed mildly, "and one that would provide considerable motive for revenge, would it not?" Henri's face flushed with anger. "Are you suggesting that I—" "Monsieur Poirot, I may have hated the man, but I am not a murderer. Besides, even if I had wished him dead, how could I possibly have placed his body upon that spire? It is physically impossible." "Précisément," Poirot murmured. "The impossibility, it troubles Poirot greatly. But let us continue. Monsieur Crawford, you observed—" "Professor Blackwood, yesterday evening. What were your impressions?" The American stepped forward with apparent reluctance. "Blackwood seemed nervous about something," he admitted. "He kept checking the manuscript, particularly that page with the illumination. At one point I saw him making notes in a small notebook, something he seemed anxious to keep private." "This notebook," Inspector Beaumont interjected. "Have you seen it since?" Crawford shook his head. "It wasn't among his personal effects in his chamber. Inspector, you might want to search more thoroughly." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "You have already examined Professor Blackwood's quarters, Monsieur Crawford?" "How thorough of you?" A flush crept up Crawford's neck. "I was merely concerned when he didn't appear for our early morning discussion. We had arranged to meet at 6 o'clock to review his findings. And when he failed to appear, you naturally took it upon yourself to investigate," Poirot said smoothly. "Most public-spirited. Tell me, what else did you discover in his chamber?" Crawford's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I noticed it, and I was certain Poirot did as well. "Nothing of significance. His bed hadn't been slept in, but that might mean nothing. Some scholars work through the night when they're excited about a discovery." Dr. Wynne looked up sharply. "His bed wasn't slept in, but he retired at the same time as the rest of us, shortly after 10 o'clock. Perhaps he returned to the scriptorium for further study," suggested Brother Augustine, who had been listening silently from the doorway. "The manuscript has been known to captivate those who study it intensively." There was something in the elderly monk's tone that made me uneasy. "You speak as if the manuscript has some sort of power over its readers, brother," I said. The monk's pale eyes met mine steadily. "The Codex Corvus has been in our keeping for 7 centuries, Captain Hastings. In that time it has been consulted by many scholars. Some have found wisdom in its pages, others—" He paused meaningfully. "Others have found only sorrow and obsession." "Superstitious nonsense," Henri muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Poirot approached the lectern where the manuscript lay open, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the illuminated page. "Brother Augustine, you mentioned yesterday that this manuscript tells of betrayal and vengeance. Can you elaborate on the specific nature of these medieval events?" The monk moved closer, his ancient fingers hovering over the parchment without quite touching it. "The manuscript tells of Master Benedict, a scholar of great learning who gathered about him many students. Among them was one called Corvus. Whether this was his true name or merely a sobriquet, we cannot know. Corvus was brilliant but envious, and when Master Benedict completed his great work on the nature of divine justice, Corvus stole the manuscript and claimed it as his own." "And the punishment?" Poirot prompted gently. "Master Benedict gathered evidence of the theft. When Corvus was exposed, the judgment was swift and dramatic. He was taken to the highest point of the abbey and impaled upon a spear, left for the ravens to witness his shame. The manuscript records that justice, though delayed, will always find its mark." Dr. Wynne had grown very pale, during this recitation. How specific the parallels are, she whispered. Indeed, Poirot agreed. But tell me, Brother Augustine, in your long years as keeper of this manuscript, have you noticed any alterations to the text? Any signs that it has been modified? The monk's expression grew troubled. Yesterday evening, after Professor Blackwood's intensive study, I observed certain discrepancies, small changes, you understand, a word altered here, a date modified there, nothing that would be obvious to a casual reader, but to one familiar with every illumination. Someone changed the manuscript? Inspector Beaumont demanded. But why would anyone do such a thing? Poirot straightened, his expression thoughtful. To create a specific narrative, perhaps. To establish a pattern that would support a particular interpretation of events. The question becomes, was the manuscript altered to reflect the crime or was the crime committed to reflect the manuscript? James Crawford frowned. You're suggesting that someone planned this murder specifically to mirror the medieval account. I am suggesting, Monsieur Crawford, that we are dealing with a mind that thinks in terms of historical precedent and symbolic justice. Our killer is not merely seeking to eliminate Professor Blackwood. They wish to make a statement about academic integrity, about the consequences of intellectual theft. Dr. Wynne's hands were trembling now. But who among us would have the knowledge to alter a medieval manuscript so skillfully? Such work requires considerable expertise in paleography and medieval Latin. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Each member of our group possessed exactly such expertise, and we all knew it. The scriptorium seemed to grow darker despite the brightening morning light, shadows gathering in the corners, like accusations waiting to be spoken. Poirot moved to examine the manuscript more closely, his magnifying glass appearing, as if by magic, from his waistcoat pocket. As he bent over the ancient pages, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, scattered among the illuminated borders, were several fresh ink blots, still faintly damp, suggesting that the alterations Brother Augustine had mentioned were made very recently indeed. Chapter 4. The Tide Turns. By midday, the causeway to Mont Saint-Michel had vanished beneath the advancing waters, leaving our little company truly isolated upon the ancient island. From the abbey's ramparts I watched the grey Norman sea swallow the narrow road that had brought us here, transforming the fortress once again into the island sanctuary it had been for 1,000 years. Most convenient for our murderer, Poirot observed, joining me at the stone parapet. No one can arrive, and more importantly, no one stone parapet. No one can arrive, and more importantly, no one can depart. We are, as you English say, all in the same boat, though in this case perhaps I should say, the same island. The advancing tide had brought with it a change in atmosphere among our group. What had begun as scholarly cooperation was rapidly deteriorating into mutual suspicion and barely concealed accusation. Dr. Wynne had withdrawn to her chamber, claiming a headache, while Henri Dubois paced the cloisters like a caged animal. Only James Crawford maintained his outward composure, though I noticed his grey eyes had taken on a watchful quality that suggested considerable inattention. Poirot, I ventured, lowering my voice, this business of the altered manuscript, surely it points to someone with considerable expertise in medieval texts. Oui, mon ami, but consider, all of our suspects possess exactly such expertise. It is, how you say, the qualification for admission to this particular gathering. He tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the ancient stone. No, the alterations tell us not who but when, and the when it may be most significant indeed. Our conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the Abbey's lower chambers. Inspector Beaumont's voice, raised in excitement, echoed, through the stone corridors, followed by the sound of running footstep. We hurried toward the disturbance, arriving to find the inspector emerging from a narrow doorway I had not previously noticed, his face flushed with discovery, and his uniform dusty from investigation. "Monsieur Poirot," he called, beckoning us forward. "You must see this. I have found equipment, climbing equipment hidden in the storage chambers below." The chamber he led us to was clearly used for abbey maintenance, coils of rope, tools for stone repair, and various implements necessary for the upkeep of such an ancient structure. But there, partially concealed behind stacks of lumber, was a collection of modern mountaineering equipment, steel pitons, climbing ropes, and a sophisticated pulley system. "Voilà," Poirot murmured, examining the gear with interest. "The impossible becomes possible, n'est-ce pas? Someone has prepared most carefully for their ascent to the spire." Brother Augustine appeared at the chamber entrance, his aged face creased with worry. "These items," he said slowly, "they are not part of the Abbey's equipment. We have no need for such things." "Then someone brought them here specifically for this purpose," Inspector Beaumont concluded. "But when? And how did they gain access to these storage areas?" "The Abbey is not locked during the day," Brother Augustine explained. "Pilgrims and visitors come and go freely. Anyone familiar with the building could have concealed these items here." Crawford had arrived during this exchange, his face showing what appeared to be genuine surprise at the discovery. "Climbing equipment? But surely that would require considerable expertise to use effectively, particularly at such a height and in darkness." "An interesting observation, Monsieur Crawford," Poirot said mildly. "You speak as one familiar with such activities?" A slight flush colored the American's features. "I've done some climbing in the Rockies, nothing as technical as this would require, but enough to recognize professional-grade equipment when I see it." Henri Dubois appeared next, drawn by our voices. His reaction to the climbing gear was markedly different. His face went pale, and I noticed his hands clench involuntarily at his sides. "Henri," Poirot observed, "you seem disturbed by this discovery. Perhaps you too have experience with mountaineering." Yes," Henri admitted reluctantly. "During my architectural studies, I spent considerable time examining the construction of cathedral spires and bell towers. One learns to adapt to heights." "How convenient." Dr. Wynne's voice came from behind us. She had appeared, silently, her earlier indisposition apparently forgotten. "It seems we have several potential climbers among our group." There was something in her tone, a note of challenge perhaps, or accusation, that made everyone present shift uncomfortably. The discovery of the climbing equipment had transformed theoretical possibility into practical reality, and suddenly the impossible murder seemed all too achievable. "We must examine this equipment for fingerprints," Inspector Beaumont declared, though his tone suggested he held little hope of useful results. "Naturellement," Poirot agreed. "But I suspect our killer has been most careful in such matters. Tell me, Inspector, have you had opportunity to examine the spire itself? Surely there must be evidence of how the climbing was accomplished." "The local fire brigade has promised to assist with that investigation," Beaumont replied. "They should arrive with the evening tide, bringing proper equipment to reach the body and examine the spire." As if summoned by mention of the macabre scene above, a fresh cacophony of ravens erupted from the direction of the tower. Through the chamber's narrow window I could see the dark birds wheeling once again around the spire, their harsh cries echoing off the stone walls. "They have not left their vigil," Brother Augustine observed quietly. "The ravens of Mont Saint-Michel, they do not abandon their post when death stalks the island." "Most atmospheric," Crawford commented dryly, "but hardly helpful for our investigation." It was then that disaster nearly struck again. We were making our way back through the Abbey's corridors when a tremendous crash echoed through the building, followed by Dr. Wynne's scream of terror. Racing toward the sound, we found her pressed against the wall of a narrow passage, her face white with shock, while at her feet lay a massive stone block that had clearly fallen from somewhere above. "Mon Dieu!" Poirot exclaimed, examining the stone and then looking upward toward the vaulted ceiling. "Madam, you are unharmed?" Yes," she gasped, her composure thoroughly shattered. "It missed me by inches. If I hadn't stopped to examine that carving on the wall—" The stone block was substantial, easily large enough to have killed her, had it struck its target. Inspector Beaumont was already examining the ceiling above, searching for signs of where it might have fallen from. "Most curious," he announced. "There appears to be no obvious place where this stone could have originated. The ceiling is intact, with no visible damage or loose masonry." Poirot was studying the fallen block with his magnifying glass. "Hastings, regard, if you please, the edges of this stone. They are not weathered as they would be from centuries of exposure to the elements. This block, it has been recently cut." "You mean someone deliberately dropped it?" I asked, though the answer seemed obvious. "Precisement. And the timing, it suggests that Dr. Wynne was specifically targeted. The question becomes, why does someone wish her harm? What does she know that makes her dangerous to our killer?" Dr. Wynne had recovered some of her composure, though her hands still trembled slightly. "I can't imagine why anyone would want to hurt me," she said. "I'm just here to study the manuscript, nothing more." But even as she spoke, I noticed her eyes dart nervously toward the other members of our group, as if she was seeing them with new understanding. Henri Dubois watched her with an expression I couldn't quite read, while Crawford maintained his characteristic inscrutability. "Perhaps," Poirot suggested gently, "it would be wise for you to remain in your chamber for the rest of the day, madam, until we understand more about our killer's intentions." As we escorted Dr. Wynne to the safety of the guest quarters, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were moving inexorably toward some predetermined conclusion, like pieces on a chessboard being maneuvered by an unseen hand. The climbing equipment, the near-fatal accident, the altered manuscript, all seemed to be parts of an elaborate design whose ultimate purpose remained frustratingly unclear. The ravens continued their vigil above, and the tide continued its relentless advance around the Abbey's foundations, cutting us off ever more completely from the outside world and the safety it represented. Chapter 5. Illuminated Manuscripts and Dark Truths. The afternoon brought with it a peculiar quality of light, grey and shifting, as if the very air around Mont Saint-Michel conspired to obscure truth rather than reveal it. Poirot had sequestered himself in the scriptorium with the Codex Corvus, his magnifying glass moving methodically across each page while he muttered occasionally in French under his breath. I found him there as the Abbey bells chimed 3 o'clock, hunched over the manuscript with the intensity of a scholar, or perhaps a detective, on the verge of a crucial discovery. "Ah, mon ami," he said without looking up, "you arrive at precisely the right moment. Come, observe this most carefully." He indicated a passage near the bottom of the page we had examined earlier, the one depicting the punishment of the thieving scholar Corvus. Under his magnifying glass I could see that certain words had indeed been altered, though so skillfully that only the most careful examination revealed the deception. "You see here," Poirot pointed with his pencil. "The original text spoke of Master Benedict's death occurring in the 20th year of his teaching. But someone has changed this to in the 30th year. A small alteration, n'est-ce pas? but one that changes the entire chronology of events. But why would anyone make such a change? I asked, peering more closely at the delicate script. To create a connection, Hastings, to establish a pattern that bridges the medieval past with the present day. Consider, if Master Benedict died 30 years ago instead of 20, what might that suggest about our current circumstances? Before I could respond, Dr. Wynne appeared in the doorway of the scriptorium, her face pale but determined. Despite Poirot's earlier advice to remain in her chamber, she had clearly decided to venture forth once more. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I believe it is time I told you the complete truth about why I came to Mont Saint-Michel." Poirot straightened, his sharp eyes fixing upon her with interest. "Indeed, madame. And what truth might that be?" She moved closer to the lectern, her hands clasped tightly before her. "My father, Dr. William Wynne, was not merely a scholar of medieval manuscripts. He was Professor Blackwood's mentor, his teacher and collaborator for many years." The words fell into the scriptorium like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of implication that seemed to spread through the very air around us. "Your father worked with Professor Blackwood?" I asked, though the answer was already becoming clear from her expression. "More than worked with him," she replied bitterly. "My father discovered the true significance of the Codex Corvus 20 years ago. He spent years researching its connections to actual historical events, uncovering evidence of a pattern of academic theft and revenge that spanned centuries. It was to be his masterwork, the culmination of his life's research." Poirot had grown very still. "And Professor Blackwood?" "Stole it," she said simply. "Every insight, every connection, every brilliant deduction my father had made, Blackwood published it under his own name, claiming the research as his original work. When my father protested, Blackwood had the academic establishment against him. No one believed that the great Edmund Blackwood could be guilty of such blatant plagiarism." "And your father, what became of him?" Poirot asked gently. Dr. Wynne's composure finally cracked, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "He couldn't bear the shame of it, seeing his life's work credited to another, watching his reputation destroyed by Blackwood's influence. He took his own life rather than face the humiliation." The silence that followed was profound. Even the ever-present sound of the ravens seemed muted, as if the very island itself was absorbing the weight of this revelation. "So you came here seeking what, madame?" Poirot inquired. "Justice, revenge, or merely answers?" "I wanted to prove that my father's research was original," she said, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "I thought if I could demonstrate that Blackwood didn't truly understand the manuscript's deeper meanings, that he was merely parroting my father's insights. But instead you found yourself trapped in a situation that mirrors the very pattern your father discovered," Poirot observed. "Most ironic and most dangerous for you personally." It was then that James Crawford appeared, having apparently been listening from the corridor. His usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain, and I noticed his hands were slightly unsteady. "Miss Wynne," he said formally, "I believe I owe you an apology, and perhaps an explanation." She turned toward him with surprise. "Mr. Crawford? My name is indeed James Crawford, but I'm not simply an amateur historian. I'm an investigative journalist, and I came to Mont Saint-Michel specifically to expose Professor Blackwood's history of plagiarism." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "Your father's case was not the only one. Blackwood had made a career of stealing other scholars' work." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "Indeed? And how many such cases have you documented, Monsieur Crawford?" "At least 6 over the past 25 years, Crawford replied grimly. Brilliant researchers who had their work stolen, their careers destroyed, their reputations ruined. Some, like Dr. Wynne's father, never recovered from the betrayal. Dr. Wynne stared at him in amazement. "You knew about my father? You knew what Blackwood had done to him?" "It was one of the cases I was investigating, yes. I had hoped to interview Blackwood here, to confront him with the evidence I'd gathered. I wanted to force him to admit publicly what he had done to all those scholars whose work he'd appropriated. Henri Dubois chose that moment to join our increasingly crowded gathering, his bitter expression suggesting he had overheard much of the conversation. "So," he said with dark satisfaction, "I was not the only victim of the great Professor Blackwood's intellectual theft. How comforting to know I had such distinguished company in my misery." "Henri," Dr. Wynne said softly, "I had no idea that you too had suffered at his hands." "Suffered?" Henri laughed harshly. "He destroyed my life as thoroughly as he apparently destroyed your father's. The difference is that I chose to live with the humiliation rather than escape it. The weight of accumulated grievances seemed to press down upon the scriptorium like a physical force. Here were 3 people, each with compelling reasons to hate Professor Blackwood, each with the knowledge and opportunity to have committed the elaborate murder that had transfixed the Abbey. Poirot studied each face in turn, his little grey cells clearly working furiously to process these revelations. "Most interesting," he murmured. "We have established motive in abundance, but motive alone does not create a murderer. There must be opportunity, means, and above all, the particular mindset that would conceive such a theatrical crime." Brother Augustine appeared in the doorway, his ancient features grave with concern. "Forgive the interruption," he said quietly, "but I felt you should know. I have discovered additional alterations to the manuscript, changes made not yesterday evening, but this very afternoon, while we were investigating the climbing equipment. The implications of this statement hit us all simultaneously. Someone had returned to the scriptorium during our absence and continued their methodical alteration of the ancient text, even after Professor Blackwood's murder." "What manner of changes?" Poirot demanded, his voice sharp with intensity. "Passages concerning justice delayed but not denied," Brother Augustine replied solemnly. "And most disturbing, new text that appears to prophesy additional deaths among those who profit from stolen wisdom." Dr. Wynne went very pale. "Additional deaths? But surely the killer has achieved their purpose with Professor Blackwood's murder?" "Perhaps," Poirot said thoughtfully. "Or perhaps Professor Blackwood was merely the first name on a very long list of intended victims." The ravens outside chose that moment to erupt once again into their harsh cries, as if they too sensed that the murder at Mont Saint-Michel was far from finished. The manuscript lay open before us, its illuminated pages seeming to pulse with malevolent life, while somewhere in the ancient abbey's shadows, a killer continued their methodical work of rewriting both history and justice to suit their own dark purposes. Chapter 6. Confessions of the Guilty. The storm that had been threatening Mont Saint-Michel all day finally broke as evening approached, sending sheets of rain against the ancient windows and howling through the abbey's corridors with the voice of 1,000 tormented souls. We had gathered in the scriptorium once more, drawn together by circumstances none of us could control, and secrets that demanded revelation. Poirot stood before the assembled group like a conductor, preparing his orchestra, his eyes moving from face to face with that peculiar intensity that indicated his mind was working at its highest pitch. The Codex Corvus lay open between us, its illuminated pages seeming to flicker in the uncertain candlelight that supplemented the Abbey's electric lamps. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the sound of the storm. "We have reached the point where truth must be separated from deception, where motive must be distinguished from opportunity, and where the guilty must be separated from the merely unfortunate." Henri Dubois shifted restlessly in his chair, his dark eyes reflecting the candlelight like those of a trapped animal. The revelations of the afternoon had clearly affected him profoundly, and I could see the internal struggle written across his features. "Monsieur Poirot," Henri said suddenly, his voice tight with emotion, "I can no longer bear this charade. You speak of guilt and innocence, but I am neither entirely innocent nor entirely guilty." Inspector Beaumont straightened in his chair. "What do you mean by that, Monsieur Dubois?" Henri rose from his seat and began pacing before the tall windows, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. "I mean that I planned Professor Blackwood's death. I studied this abbey for months, mapped every passage, every hidden stair, every architectural detail. I brought the climbing equipment here piece by piece over several visits, concealing it in the storage chambers below." Dr. Wynne gasped audibly, while Crawford's face remained carefully neutral. Brother Augustine crossed himself silently. "You are confessing to murder?" Inspector Beaumont demanded, reaching for his notebook. "I am confessing to planning a murder," Henri corrected, his voice growing stronger. "But I did not execute that plan. Someone else did, someone who knew exactly what I intended and used my preparations for their own purposes." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Most fascinating. Continue, if you please." Henri turned away from the window, his face haggard but determined. "Last night I could not sleep. The thought of finally confronting Blackwood, of making him pay for what he had done to my career, it consumed me. At approximately 2 o'clock this morning, I made my way to the storage chambers to retrieve the climbing equipment." "And?" Poirot prompted gently. "It was gone," Henri said simply. "All of it. The ropes, the pitons, the pulleys. Everything I had so carefully hidden over the past months had vanished. Someone had discovered my cache and taken it for their own use." The silence that followed was broken only by the drumming of rain against stone and the distant cry of ravens sheltering from the storm. "Did you see anyone? Hear anything that might indicate who had taken your equipment?" Inspector Beaumont asked. Henri shook his head. "Nothing. I searched the Abbey as thoroughly as I dared, but found no trace of the gear. It was as if it had simply evaporated. Yet this morning we discovered the equipment in the very chambers where you claim to have hidden it," Poirot observed. "How do you explain this apparent contradiction?" "Someone returned it after using it for the murder," Henri replied. "They wanted it to be found, wanted me to be implicated in Blackwood's death. Don't you see? I've been manipulated from the beginning. My hatred, my knowledge of the Abbey, my careful preparations, all of it used by someone else to commit the perfect crime." Dr. Wynne leaned forward, her face pale but intent. "Henri, if what you're saying is true, then the real killer knew about your plans. They must have been watching you, studying your movements." "Précisément," Poirot agreed. "The question becomes, who among our little group would have had the opportunity to observe Monsieur Dubois so closely? Who could have discovered his preparations and appropriated them for their own use?" Crawford cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I must admit I had noticed Henri's unusual interest in the Abbey's architecture during our previous visits. He spent considerable time examining the tower structure, asking detailed questions about access routes to the upper levels." "You were watching me?" Henri demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. "I was watching everyone," Crawford replied evenly. "As an investigative journalist, I've learned to observe behavioral patterns, to notice when people are concealing their true intentions. Your obsession with Blackwood was obvious." Brother Augustine spoke for the first time since Henri's confession began. "I too noticed Monsieur Dubois' frequent examinations of the Abbey's structure, but I assumed it was merely scholarly interest in our architectural heritage." "How convenient," Dr. Wynne said softly, and there was something in her tone that made everyone turn to look at her. Everyone was watching Henri. Everyone knew of his hatred for Blackwood. Everyone could have anticipated his plans. Poirot studied her with renewed interest. "You sound as if you speak from personal knowledge, madame." Dr. Wynne's composure began to crack under his penetrating gaze. I simply meant that Henri's feelings were hardly a secret. We all knew how Blackwood had destroyed his career." "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "But knowledge and action are two very different things. Tell me, madame, during your own visits to the Abbey, for I suspect this was not your first time here, did you too notice Monsieur Dubois' unusual interest in the architecture?" "My own visits?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "I don't know what you mean." "Come now, madame. A scholar of your expertise does not undertake such an important research project without considerable preliminary investigation. You would have visited Mont Saint-Michel several times to prepare for this gathering, would you not?" Dr. Wynne's hands began to tremble. Yes, I made a few preliminary visits to familiarize myself with the Abbey's layout, to speak with Brother Augustine about the manuscript." "And during these visits, you observed Monsieur Dubois' preparations," Poirot stated, rather than asked. "You saw him hiding the climbing equipment, studying the tower structure, planning his revenge against Professor Blackwood." "That's not— I didn't—" she began, then stopped abruptly as if realizing she had already said too much. Inspector Beaumont was scribbling furiously in his notebook. "Are you suggesting that Dr. Wynne knew of Monsieur Dubois' murder plot in advance?" "I am suggesting more than that," Poirot replied gravely. "I am suggesting that Dr. Wynne not only knew of the plot, but decided to appropriate it for her own purposes. After all, why go to the trouble of planning a murder when someone else has already done the work for you?" The storm outside seemed to intensify at that moment, lightning illuminating the scriptorium in stark, theatrical flashes. Dr. Wynne had gone very pale, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "You can't prove any of this," she whispered. "You're simply guessing, making wild accusations based on speculation." "Perhaps," Poirot acknowledged. "But I think we shall find that the evidence supports more than mere speculation. Tell me, madame, what did you do with Professor Blackwood's missing notebook, the one Monsieur Crawford mentioned, the one containing his private thoughts about the manuscript's true significance?" Dr. Wynne's eyes darted wildly around the room, seeking escape where none existed. Henry was staring at her with dawning comprehension, while Crawford watched with the cold interest of a journalist scenting the climax of a long investigation. I don't know anything about a notebook," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. Brother Augustine had been listening to this exchange with growing distress. "Dr. Wynne," he said gently, "if you have knowledge that could help us understand these terrible events, surely it would be better to speak freely now." But Dr. Wynne remained silent, her face a mask of stubborn defiance, even as tears began to stream down her cheeks. The weight of accumulated evidence was pressing down upon her, like the storm pressing down upon the Abbey, and yet she held to her denials with the desperate strength of someone who knew that confession meant not merely acknowledgement of guilt, but the final destruction of everything she had fought to preserve. Chapter 7. The Murder of Crows. The storm reached its crescendo as Poirot led our small procession through the Abbey's winding corridors toward the tower that had witnessed Professor Blackwood's theatrical demise. Lightning illuminated the ancient stones in stark, supernatural flashes, while thunder rolled across Mont Saint-Michel, like the voice of divine judgment itself. "Mes amis," Poirot announced as we climbed the narrow spiral staircase, "the time has come for Poirot to demonstrate how our killer accomplished the impossible, and more importantly, why they chose to do so in such an elaborate manner." Dr. Wynne followed reluctantly, her face pale and drawn in the flickering torchlight. Henri Dubois climbed behind her with the grim fascination of one witnessing the exposure of his own manipulated plans, while Crawford maintained his journalistic composure despite the dramatic circumstances. Inspector Beaumont brought up the rear, his heavy breathing echoing in the confined space as we ascended toward the Abbey's highest reaches. "The beauty of this crime," Poirot continued as we climbed, "lies not merely in its execution, but in its misdirection. Our killer wished us to focus on the impossibility of the act itself, rather than on the deeper question of motivation and opportunity." We emerged onto a narrow stone platform perhaps 30 feet below the spire where Professor Blackwood's body still hung silhouetted against the storm-lashed sky. Here, the full force of the wind and rain struck us, and I had to grip the stone parapet to maintain my balance. "Observe, if you please," Poirot shouted over the howling wind, pointing toward a series of iron rungs set into the tower's outer wall. The Abbey's builders, they were practical men. They provided means for maintenance of the spire, though these handholds have not been used for many decades. Inspector Beaumont examined the ancient rungs with his electric torch. "But surely, climbing to such a height would require exceptional skill and strength." "Mais non, Inspector, not when one employs the proper equipment and techniques." Poirot moved to a shadowed alcove where Henri's stolen climbing gear had been concealed after its use. "Observe how the ropes have been arranged. A sophisticated pulley system that would allow even a person of moderate strength to hoist both themselves and other cargo to the summit." Dr. Wynne shrank back against the summit. Dr. Wynne shrank back against the stone wall as Poirot demonstrated the rope system's mechanics. "You're suggesting that Professor Blackwood was already dead when he was placed on the spire?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I am stating it as fact, madam. The positioning of the body, the complete absence of defensive wounds, the theatrical arrangement that so perfectly mirrors the manuscript's illumination, all of this speaks to careful post-mortem staging rather than murder committed at the scene." Crawford was taking notes despite the driving rain. "But how was Blackwood actually killed, and where?" "An excellent question, Monsieur Crawford, and one that leads us to the heart of our killer's psychology." Poirot turned to face Dr. Wynne directly. "Tell us, madame, about your father's study in Oxford, about the room where he spent his final hours before taking his own life." Dr. Wynne's composure cracked entirely at this unexpected question. What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything, I fear. You see, Hastings, our killer is someone driven, not merely by the desire for revenge, but by the need to create perfect symbolic justice. Professor Blackwood did not die here on the tower. He died in circumstances that exactly mirrored those of Dr. William Wynne 20 years ago." The implications of this statement sent a chill through our small group that had nothing to do with the storm raging around us. Henri stared at Dr. Wynne with dawning horror, while Crawford's journalistic detachment finally began to crack. "You're saying that Margaret killed Blackwood in the same manner as her father's suicide?" Inspector Beaumont demanded. "Précisément. The same room, the same method, even the same time of day, perfect justice, as our killer saw it, forcing Blackwood to experience exactly what his theft and betrayal had driven Dr. Wynne to endure. Dr. Wynne was trembling now, whether from cold or emotion I could not tell. "You can't know that," she whispered. "You weren't there. No one was there." "But someone was there, madame. You were there. You lured Professor Blackwood to your father's old study at Oxford, a room you have maintained exactly as it was 20 years ago, have you not? A shrine to his memory and your desire for vengeance." Lightning illuminated Dr. Wynne's face in stark relief, revealing an expression of such anguish and fury that I involuntarily stepped backward. For a moment, the mask of scholarly composure dropped entirely, and I glimpsed the depths of hatred that had sustained her through 2 decades of careful planning. "He deserved it," she said suddenly, her voice rising above the storm. "He deserved to know what it felt like to face death alone and betrayed, just as my father did." "Margaret," Henri said hoarsely, "what have you done?" But Dr. Wynne was beyond rational conversation now, caught up in the release of emotions too long suppressed. "You want to know how I did it? How I accomplished the impossible? I'll tell you." She moved toward the edge of the platform with a sudden, desperate energy that made Inspector Beaumont reach for his handcuffs. "I studied Blackwood for months, learned his habits, his weaknesses, his vanities. I knew he would never resist the opportunity to examine my father's private papers, papers I told him contained evidence that would vindicate his theft of my father's work." "So you lured him to Oxford," Poirot observed calmly. "I drugged his wine with laudanum, the same drug my father used to end his life. When Blackwood realized what was happening, when he understood that he was dying exactly as my father had died," her voice broke with savage satisfaction. "The terror in his eyes was everything I had dreamed of for 20 years. Crawford was scribbling frantically despite the rain soaking his notebook. "But how did you transport the body here? How did you manage the physical aspects of the crime?" Dr. Wynne laughed, a sound that sent ice through my veins. "Henry provided everything I needed, though he never knew it. I followed him here, watched him hide his equipment, studied his plans for revenge. When the time came, I simply appropriated his preparations for my own purposes." Henri's face had gone ashen. "You used me. You let me believe I was planning my own revenge when all along I was planning something far more elegant than your crude notion of justice," she finished. "My father's death required something more sophisticated than simple murder. It required the complete restoration of his reputation and the exposure of Blackwood's pattern of theft." Inspector Beaumont was struggling with his handcuffs in the howling wind. "Dr. Wynne, I arrest you for the murder of Professor Edmund Blackwood." But as he spoke, Dr. Wynne took another step toward the platform's edge, her eyes wild with a desperate calculation that filled me with sudden terror. The stone parapet was barely waist-high, and beyond it lay a drop of more than 200 feet to the Abbey's courtyard below. "Justice," she said, her voice eerily calm despite the chaos around us. "Justice delayed but not denied. The ravens know, don't they? They've been waiting 20 years for this moment." And indeed, despite the raging storm, I could hear them, the harsh cries of the island's ancient guardians, circling endlessly around the tower where their vigil had begun with Professor Blackwood's death and would end only when the final accounting was complete. Chapter 8. Justice with the Tide. The standoff on the tower platform lasted only moments, though it felt like an eternity suspended between lightning and thunder, between confession and consequence. Dr. Wynne stood poised at the stone parapet's edge, the wild wind whipping her dark hair about her face as she gazed down at the Abbey's courtyard, far below. "Margaret," Henry called desperately, "this will not bring your father back. This will not restore what was taken from him." "Won't it?" she replied, her voice eerily calm despite the chaos of the storm. "The manuscript will tell the true story now. The world will know that Edmund Blackwood built his reputation on stolen brilliance, that my father died for another man's greed." Inspector Beaumont had managed to secure his handcuffs despite the driving rain, but he dared not approach closer for fear of precipitating the very tragedy he sought to prevent. "Dr. Wynne, step away from the edge. Whatever you've done, whatever drove you to it, this isn't the answer." Poirot, however, remained remarkably composed, his sharp eyes fixed not on Dr. Wynne, but on something beyond her, the causeway below, where the receding tide was beginning to reveal secrets that had been hidden beneath the Norman waters. "Ah, madame," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the wind with surprising clarity. "But you have made one crucial error in your otherwise perfect plan." Dr. Wynne turned toward him, momentarily distracted from her precarious position. "What do you mean?" "The tide, madame. She is your betrayer. Observe, if you please, what the retreating waters have revealed." We all followed his gesture toward the causeway, where the storm's lightning illuminated a sight that made my blood run cold. There, partially buried in the sand and seaweed exposed by the low tide, was the unmistakable outline of a motor car, not the vehicle that had brought us to Mont Saint-Michel, but another, older automobile that had clearly been concealed beneath the waters for some time. Crawford understood immediately. "The car you used to transport Blackwood's body from Oxford," he said, his journalist's instincts connecting the evidence. "You drove here during high tide and deliberately submerged it, knowing it would be hidden until the waters receded." Dr. Wynne's face went white as she realized the implications. "That's impossible. I calculated the tides precisely. That car should remain hidden for days yet." "Mais non, madame," Poirot replied gently. "You calculated based on normal tidal patterns, but you failed to account for the storm, the atmospheric pressure, the wind. They have accelerated the tide's retreat by several hours. Your carefully laid plans, they are undone by forces beyond your control." Inspector Beaumont was already signaling to the Abbey below with his electric torch, summoning assistants to examine this crucial piece of evidence. "That vehicle will contain forensic proof of the body's transport, won't it? Blood, hair, fibers, all the physical evidence needed to confirm your confession. More than that," Henri added with growing realization, "it will prove premeditation. The careful planning, the precise timing. This wasn't a crime of passion, but a calculated execution." Dr. Wynne seemed to deflate at this revelation, the desperate energy that had sustained her through the confrontation, draining away like the tide below. She stepped back from the parapet's edge, her shoulders sagging with the weight of inevitability. 20 years, she whispered, more to herself than to us. 20 years I planned this moment, and it's undone by weather and water. Brother Augustine, who had remained silent throughout the dramatic confrontation, finally spoke. "Dr. Wynne, your father was a good man, a brilliant scholar who deserved better than the betrayal he suffered, but surely he would not have wanted his memory preserved through such violence." "You didn't know him," she replied bitterly. "You didn't see what Blackwood's theft did to him, the despair, the shame, the slow destruction of everything he believed in. Justice isn't always gentle, brother. Sometimes it requires blood." "Perhaps," Poirot interjected, "but justice without wisdom becomes merely vengeance, and vengeance, as the Codex Corvus itself demonstrates, has a way of consuming those who pursue it." As if summoned by his words, the storm began to abate, the lightning growing more distant, and the thunder fading to a distant rumble. Through the clearing air, we could hear the harsh cries of the ravens, as they settled back into their ancient vigil around the Abbey's towers. Crawford was still taking notes, his journalist's mind already composing the story that would expose not just Dr. Wynne's crime, but the entire pattern of academic theft that had precipitated it. "The world will know the truth about Blackwood's plagiarism," he said firmly. "Your father's work will be properly attributed, his reputation restored." "Will it?" Dr. Wynne asked with bitter irony. "Or will this become simply another sordid tale of murder and revenge, obscuring the very injustices it was meant to illuminate?" Inspector Beaumont approached carefully, the handcuffs ready. "Dr. Margaret Wynne, I arrest you for the murder of Professor Edmund Blackwood. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence." She offered no resistance as the handcuffs clicked into place, her fight finally exhausted. "There's something else you should know," she said as Beaumont led her toward the staircase. "Professor Blackwood wasn't the only one. Crawford was right. There were others, victims across the decades. I have documentation, evidence of at least 8 cases of blatant plagiarism." "Where is this evidence?" Poirot inquired. "Hidden in my father's study, the same room where Blackwood died. Everything is there, letters, documents, proof of a career built on systematic theft." She paused, looking back at the manuscript, visible through the scriptorium's windows. "The Codex Corvus will tell its story now, the true story of how the ravens of justice finally came home to roost." As we made our way down the narrow spiral staircase, I reflected on the events that had transformed our scholarly retreat into a theatre of revenge and revelation. The storm was clearing, and through the Abbey's windows I could see the causeway beginning to emerge from the retreating waters, connecting Mont Saint-Michel once again to the world beyond its ancient walls. By morning, the authorities would examine the submerged motor car and find the evidence that would seal Dr. Wynne's fate. Henri Dubois would return to France carrying the knowledge that his thirst for revenge had been manipulated and exploited, while James Crawford would write the story that would finally expose Edmund Blackwood's systematic plagiarism and restore the reputations of his many victims. The Codex Corvus would return to its place in the Abbey's collection, its recent alteration serving as a reminder that the medieval tales of justice and betrayal it contained were not merely historical curiosities, but eternal patterns that continue to play out across the centuries. The manuscript had been used as both weapon and confession, its illuminated pages bearing witness to crimes both ancient and modern. As we reached the Abbey's main level, I caught sight of Brother Augustine carefully closing the ancient tome, his weathered hands gentle as he turned the final page. The ravens outside had grown quiet at last. Their vigil ended with the restoration of justice to Mont Saint-Michel. The murder of crows that had gathered to witness Professor Blackwood's theatrical demise was dispersing into the clearing night, returning to their eternal watch over the island's secrets. The tide would turn again as it had for 1,000 years, but the truth would remain exposed on the causeway of time, undeniable and permanent as the ancient stones of Mont Saint-Michel itself. Thanks for joining us for A Murder of Crows at Mont Saint-Michel. Did you suspect Dr. Margaret Wynne before Poirot revealed how she manipulated Henri's revenge plot for her own elaborate scheme? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this atmospheric adventure with Hercule Poirot, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Poirot's wisdom. The little grey cells reveal that vengeance disguised as justice can corrupt even the most noble intentions, and that ancient stones may witness modern sins, but time and tide ultimately expose all truths. This is Alfie signing off from Cafe Stories.